to post any questions or comments you may have in the chat function. I'll be going through those and posting some of those questions to our speakers at the end. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome and introduce the chair for tonight's event, David Glasser. David is the chair of trustees of the Ben Uri Gallery. He was born in Glasgow and he built his career at Marks and Spencer's PLC originally, where he pioneered the food-only store concept. He became involved in the Ben Uri Gallery in the late 1990s, and he agreed to lead the development of a new strategic plan. The idea was to reinvigorate and re-establish the gallery, and as at the time it had been closed to the general public. In October 2000, he was elected executive chair, and he's operated since in a full-time role before moving on to become chair of trustees. His focus has been on creating a new style of museum engagement, which addresses contemporary issues through the visual creative arts. Welcome, David. David, you'll need to unmute.
You see, my technology ability is lacking. So I thank you, Toby, and I offer a warm welcome to everybody this evening. And I think the fact that there are so many people who are wishing to attend this event actually pays a great compliment and recognizes the importance of not only the occasion, but actually the story itself of Hollitscher and how this whole story evolved, which is really down to Ines Newman, his granddaughter, who will speak shortly. I think it's just worth putting into context, if I may, how little changes in history. 1939, when internment was initiated after the war was declared, on the 28th of September, there was internment tribunal set up. And I suspect that our civil service, who are the greatest record keepers, I suspect, ever and anywhere, used the mechanisms of all these years ago to establish the internment of 2020. Today we have 3 tiers. And in 1939, there was also 3 tiers. There was category A, for those people out of the 70,000 Austrian and German emigres living in this country who were interned. Category B, those who were exempt from internment but had very strong restrictions. And category C, those who were exempt from internment and from restrictions. So I can't help feeling there's a parallel between 80 years ago. This week is also very important in terms of not just because it's the 80th anniversary of internment, but it's also the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. And I think that is a somber and poignant moment in history, and something that the Wiener Library, of course, is focused on greatly. And Ben Uri also, in terms of our research unit, where we're looking at the Jewish and immigrant contribution to British art since 1900. And of course, the Hitler emigres form a great part of that. So everything actually is sort of rolled into one very accessible ball for us to play with this evening. And what I'd like to do first is to welcome Anthony Spiro, who is the joint president of the Wiener Library and has his own particular connections with the subject. And Anthony, could I ask you to, first of all, thank you for hosting this evening, and can I ask you to say a few words? Anthony?
Anthony, you'll need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Toby. And thank you, David, and good evening, everyone. The Wiener Holocaust Library is delighted to be co-hosting tonight's event. The library, as you've just heard, is the UK's leading resource of information to oppose anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice and intolerance. Because much of the library's archive was acquired at the time the events occurred, its collections have an authenticity and immediacy not present elsewhere. The library holds many personal archives, ranging from a few pages to numerous boxes of papers. And if you have papers which you think could be of interest, please contact the library. They'd be delighted to hear from you. The library, in normal circumstances, runs an extensive outreach program with amazing speakers and exhibitions. The current exhibition, Jewish Resistance to the Holocaust, will open again after lockdown, and I hope you'll visit and consider becoming supporters of the library. One of the many items in the collection is the internment diary of Wilhelm Hollitscher. Surprisingly, no one knows who gave the diary to the library. Ralph Oppenheimer, Wilhelm's grandson and Ines' brother, and a great supporter of the library, kindled his sister's interest in the manuscript, and that ultimately led to the creation of the book being launched today. Wilhelm Hollidger was an engineer who spent some 30 years with the Danube Steamboat Company, ultimately as chief engineer. He later set up his own business marketing boilers. And in 1938, at the age of 65, his comfortable retirement in Vienna was thrown into turmoil by the Anschluss. He witnessed the November pogrom and managed to leave Vienna for England in March 39. In 1940, along with thousands of other enemy aliens, he was interned. Hollitscher was taken to a camp in Huyton near Liverpool, while most internees were sent to the Isle of Man. During his 10 weeks at Huyton, he took an active part in camp life and attended many cultural events. He sat for the artist Hugo Dachinger, whose lost portrait of Hollitscher plays a part in Ines Newman's book. Life in Huyton was not comfortable, particularly for someone in his mid-60s. But Hollitscher adapted, and deep down, he probably quite enjoyed it. It does seem extraordinary that the British government detained thousands of German and Austrian Jewish refugees as enemy aliens, when they were probably more anti-Nazi than the British themselves. And after internment, many of them signed up for active service and made a significant contribution to the war effort. The xenophobia that led to internment was whipped up by the Daily Mail and Daily Express, so some things never change. On a personal note, I was fascinated by this book because my parents spent over a year on the Isle of Man, my father in Onken camp and my mother in Port Erin. A record of my father's experience is held at the Imperial War Museum. My wife was interested because through this book, she's learnt that her father's uncle, her great uncle, was a close friend of Hollitscher, and he obtained the visa and provided the finance that enabled Wilhelm to escape from Vienna and come to England.
Thank you so much. Am I hearing? Am I muted or not muted? I think I'm.
We can hear you, David.
We can hear me. Thank you so much, Anthony, for such a perfect introduction to the evening. Can I just take you back a few years to June 2016 and to give you a very, very succinct potted history of how Ben-Uri works in terms of acquiring works for the collection. We've been adding to the collection vociferously in a very methodical and targeted way since 2002 when we relaunched Ben-Uri. And we have relationships with auction houses across the country, across Europe, across America, and across South America, and also in South Africa. And it is a constant review of works coming up to see what it is, whether it's on our target list, and whether we can possibly afford it, and if we can't, how on earth can we raise the money to buy it? And on the 27th of June, I scanned an auction house catalogue, which I had put down on my desk for a few days, and not got to, and suddenly went into a panic on the evening of the 27th and said, oh my God, I haven't looked. And before I went to bed, I went through page after page, and there was a painting that became perfectly obvious that it had Ben-Hur, in terms of our research focus, written all over it. It was a portrait of a man, a distinguished looking man, almost military, painted on the front cover of the Times newspaper. Now, Ben-Hur's been collecting art for a very long time, but rarely have we ever seen a really excellent piece of work painted on a newspaper. And when we looked at the signature, and we looked to see who it was by Dachinger, who we already knew because we had 2 drawings by Dachinger, because paintings are very rare. And it became more and more interesting. And within 20 minutes, we'd worked it out. Emails went flying around, even late in the evening. And by the morning, we had all agreed that we were going to buy this work with a very flexible target sum. In other words, whatever it took within reason. And we bought this work, having absolutely no idea who the subject was, but we did know that it was from Huyton. We knew from the date, and we knew that it was clearly an important and rare example of art behind wire. That's all I'm going to tell you, because I think more of the story will come out. But that's the background. And now it gives me really huge pleasure to introduce you to a remarkable woman, Ines Newman, Wilhelm's granddaughter. And without her energy and passion and sheer grit, we would not be sitting here this evening talking about Wilhelm's story and able to buy and read this book about his life. Ines, please join us and tell us the story.
So I actually wanted to start by saying thank you both to David and Anthony and Tony Simpson for all of your help, both from the Ben-Hur Gallery and Museum and from the Wiener Holocaust Library. This book would not have been possible without that help and support. So and for today, actually, this launch has been made possible by both those institutions. They're great institutions. Do go and look at their exhibitions when we're all out of lockdown. So let me start by introducing you all to my maternal grandfather, Wilhelm Hollitscher. Here he is. I think you can see from the photo that he was a very warm character and a bon viveur who liked to laugh with his friends. I would have loved to have met him, and I'm sure he would have been a loving and a fun person to be with. And I know he was a good storyteller. I'll not be telling you much today. Anthony's given you a bit of his introduction to him. I really wanted to concentrate today on why I'm writing, why I wanted to put together this book and get it published. So Wilhelm died in 1943, 4 years before I was born. My family were in Egypt and only arrived in the UK in 1949. And then in 1954, my mother died. So we had no one to answer all the questions you ask about your grandparents as you get older. There is no doubt this feeling of not knowing my mother and her parents was a strong motivation in getting involved in family history. There was also the fact that I and my elder sister, who had the language skills that we needed, were getting older, and if we didn't do the research, it might be lost completely for non-German speaking future generations. And then, as Anthony has explained, my brother Ralph found the library in the Wiener Library, and we started looking at it soon after that. The library, the diary was actually started by my grandfather 3 months after he arrived in England in 1939 from Vienna, and he filled it in every day until his death in 1943. It was a big surprise. It was in 14 exercise books, in closely written and very neat handwriting, but to us illegible. The library helped us find a transcriber, and then my sister Hannah started a very long job of translation. The diary contained reflections on his personal life, the people he'd met, the political situation, commentaries on what he'd read and on both British and Austrian radio broadcasts, which he listened to, and anecdotes about his life. But what interested me particularly was the daily record of his internment as an enemy alien from the 27th of June to the 31st of August 1940. So my first purpose of putting together the book was to make people more aware of the horrors of internment policy. My daughter Hannah commented that reflecting on internment is particularly pertinent now when we're all in lockdown and in a less serious way dealing with very similar restrictions. And I think that's true. I myself knew very little about internment beyond the fact that there was an internment camp on the Isle of Man where, as Anthony said, his father was kept and his mother. Wilhelm was interned in Huyton near Liverpool. Charmian Brinson has written an excellent chapter in our book about internment, and we'll introduce this after I've spoken. The diary describes both the horrors and creativity generated by the camp, which included both Nazis and many Jews who'd recently escaped similar conditions in Germany and Austria. Wilhelm was 67 and he was not in good health. He wanted desperately to return to his relatives in his English home in South London, where he felt comfortable. But he also made many friends in the camp, and he, as Anthony said, participated in its rich cultural life. One of the people he befriended was Hugo Dachinger, a young artist from Vienna, and another reason for doing the book has been to get greater recognition of Dachinger's talent. Whether or not you become a famous artist very much depends on where you are and when. And Hugo was pushed to England when there was no real understanding of German expressionist art. I hope the book will belatedly give him the appreciation he deserves. When my grandfather first met him, he comments on the pictures of nude women that decorated his room, jokingly saying they were family pictures. So here is one of the examples of what my grandfather called a family picture. It is one of the 8 colour plates in the book, and Rachel Dixon will be talking about Dachinger and the art that emerged from internment shortly. Over a fortnight in August 1940, Wilhelm subsequently described various sittings in his diary, the first taking place on the 5th of August. In all, 4 paintings and sketches were made. He comments that Dachinger sees him as he is, with all the stress that he has met in the camp, and more like the photo that his son Hansel took of him after his first operation, and not as he tries to appear to the world, where he tries to appear more well and outgoing. Having read about the portraits, I set out on a quest to find at least one. I started in August 2017, writing and sending a copy of the photo of my grandfather to the Walker Gallery in Liverpool, which had mounted an exhibition, Art Behind Barbed Wire, in 2004. Unfortunately, the 5 male portraits in the Walker Gallery collection did not look like my grandfather, but the curator, Alex, suggested that I contact independent art dealers who previously dealt with or sold Dachinger's work. I had no idea how to do this. I wasn't an art specialist at all, so I asked for further advice and was surprised to receive an email a week later from her with an image attached, saying she'd been looking at the Blue Women Art Sales Index, probably the one that David had just mentioned, a database they use to value works of art. And she continued, interestingly, my attention was caught by the first item on the list, entitled Portrait of a Man, Head and Shoulders. I think the gentleman in the picture looks remarkably like your grandfather. What do you think? I agreed the image did look like him, and it was lovely to get my first view of the portrait, albeit in a thumbnail picture. And I immediately wrote to the auction house that had sold the painting on the 28th of June 2016, but they wouldn't give me details of who bought the painting, citing client confidentiality. It seemed like I was at a dead end. And then on the 15th of March 2018, I'd been pruning the roses when I stepped down off the ladder and I slipped and fell back on the stone steps. I'd injured a rib on my back and was sitting on the sofa watching News at 10 on the BBC and feeling extremely sorry for myself. Then the local news came up and there was an interview with David Glasser talking about the Ben-Uri Gallery exhibition out of Austria, Austrian artists in exile in Great Britain, 1933 to 1945. Suddenly, the Dachinger portrait of my grandfather appeared on the screen. Having seen the photo, I immediately recognised it and I leapt out of the sofa in excitement despite my pain. The portrait had been bought from the auction house, as David explained, by the Ben-Uri Gallery. They didn't know the identity of the sitter and they were delighted to find out more about their acquisition. The diary and my grandfather's subsequent letters also revealed that Wilhelm kept up with Dachinger after they were both released from internment. My grandfather, Hugo Dachinger's dream was to publish his Haydn diary together with 12 Dachinger pen sketches, but shortage of paper during the war made this impossible. So this was the other major reason for doing the book. It's been very exciting to me to realise this dream, particularly given that this year is the 80th anniversary of internment. It has also been a delight for me to get to know my grandfather through his diary. He has emerged as an intelligent, kind, positive, warm, friendly and charismatic man, if somewhat of a male chauvinist pig. And despite his dream failing during his lifetime, the story has a further happy ending. On the 24th of April 1943, Wilhelm was a witness at Dachinger's marriage. He lived his last few years contentedly, confronting everything that fate had meted out to him, including the blitz when he left internment, with optimism and a zest for life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ines. It's the excitement and the passion that you have, understandably, for the subject from these few years ago is still bursting through, and it's inspirational. We have a very distinguished panel this evening, not just of innocent family involvement, but of professional scholars of this subject. And I'd like to introduce Professor Charmian Brinson. Charmian is the Emeritus Professor of German at Imperial College London. She is also a founder member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, of which our second speaker, Rachel Dixon, is also a member of, from the School of Advanced Studies in the University of London. And most of her research has been carried out in this field. She has published extensively, and particularly on political exile, including with Richard Dove, A Matter of Intelligence, M15, M15, and the Surveillance of Anti-Nazi Refugees in 2014, and yet to appear in early next year, hopefully, Working for the War Effort, German-speaking refugees and British propaganda in the Second World War. Charmian, we are absolutely delighted and privileged to have you with us, and thank you, and please take over.
Thank you very much. I am going to go straight into the subject without too much introduction, simply to give you a background to the internment crisis. So, during the course of the Second World War in Britain, around 25,000 German and Austrian men and 4,000 women were interned, many of them refugees from Nazi oppression, either on racial and/or political grounds. This was nothing new. Internment of enemy aliens had previously taken place in the First World War as well. However, when war broke out again in 1939, the Home Secretary, Sir John Anderson, initially ruled out the reintroduction of mass internment because of the refugee status of most of those affected. But by 1940, however, after the German army had occupied Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium and France, in turn, and with the Nazi invasion of Britain a very real threat, the British authorities bowed to intense public and press pressure and began to intern most of the male and some of the female refugee population. In fact, during the autumn of 1939, the refugees, as enemy aliens, so-called, had already been required to appeal before alien tribunals, had been placed in one of three categories. This has already been mentioned, A, B, and C, with A indicating a presumed threat to British security, leading to immediate internment, B, that some doubt could be held to exist, and C, which was the vast majority, that the refugee was deemed loyal to the British cause. But there was, however, a great deal of confusion surrounding this process, with the first batch of Category A suspects containing probably as many anti-Nazis and Jews as it did genuine Nazis. There was particular confusion surrounding the doubtful B category, since some of the tribunals used different criteria from other tribunals when arriving at it. The move from a selective to a mass internment policy occurred in May and June 1940. Until then, categories B and C refugees remained largely at liberty, but by mid-1940, categories B and C refugees were included in the internment process for the first time. Category B men were arrested on the 16th of May, Category B women on the 27th of May, Italians who as enemy aliens were subject to the same policy on the 10th of June, and the largest group, Category C men, from 22nd of June 1940. With a few exceptions, Category C women were never interned, which explains why the numbers of male internees so far outstripped those of female internees. The majority were held in camps on the Isle of Man, as indeed had been the case in the First World War. Though some were initially held in civilian prisons like Holloway or Brixton, or spent the first days or weeks of their internment in transit camps, hastily constructed out of, for example, a racecourse, an unfinished housing estate, or in one case in Bertram Mills's winter quarters for circus animals. Wilhelm Hollidger, who's the subject of today's book launch, of course, was designated Category C. In other words, as loyal to the Allied cause, and interned first in Kempton Park Camp, a former racecourse, and later in Huyton Camp near Liverpool. Hollidger's arrest on the 26th of June 1940 and his subsequent internment ran along lines fairly similar at the time. Police arrived at his door early in the morning, allowed him an hour to pack, took him to the local police station and from there to a larger holding area, in his case in Chelsea, where he found himself one of 100 Category C enemy aliens. And from there, they were transported to a transit camp, Kempton Park, the collecting station for the London region, where the numbers swelled to 1,800 and confusion reigned. Kempton was one of several racecourses used as an emergency measure for internment, and conditions were primitive, with next to no furniture and inadequate food and medical facilities. Hollicher was not among those sent on to the Isle of Man, but rather to Huyton Camp, a newly built but unfinished council estate. It had been founded in May 1940 as a camp, in time for the first group of Category B internees. The Category C ones came later, and it held upwards of 3,000 men, though sometimes there were as many as 5,000 at any one time. The reason for the fluctuating population was that Huyton, too, was initially conceived as a transit camp, so that batches of internees were periodically transferred into and out of the camp. In his diary, Hollitscher records the departure of numerous fellow internees for the Isle of Man or the Dominions, including his portraitist Hugo Dachinger. Hugo Dachinger to Morag Camp, Isle of Man, and it's likely that Hollitscher too would have been transferred to the Isle of Man had he not been released after only two months' internment. Except for the work by Dr. Jennifer Taylor, who's a colleague of mine at the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies, less has been written about life in Huyton Camp than in the better-known Isle of Man internment camps, such as Hutchinson and Onken. However, although unlike the latter camps, Huyton produced no camp newspaper that would have recorded aspects of everyday life, there are, apart from Hollitscher's own diary, several extant accounts from fellow Huytonians. These include one covering much the same period of time as Hollitscher's, and therefore supplementary rather usefully, written by the elderly pacifist Otto Lehmann-Russell. From these diarists, we learn that in the camp's unfinished state, there was initially no furniture, no soap or toilet paper, no hot water, no proper medical facilities, and insufficient food. Straw-filled paliasses functioned as beds. The unfinished houses provided basic accommodation with 12 or more internees per house. but the overspill, particularly the under 25s, were relegated to tents. Perhaps worse than that, Neymar Russell, whose internment journey from Kempton to Huyton, his advanced age and his poor state of health was similar to Hollitscher's, recorded the hostility and suspicion towards the internees displayed by the British Guards and some of the British misapprehensions. One officer had later explained to an interned German professor that he'd initially believed that the internees were all secret Nazis. Another had expressed his surprise that there were so many Jews among the Nazis. Yet another had believed that the internees were all prisoners of war. It should be noted, however, that Hollicher's experience was not quite the same. He mentions the more peaceful reception he encountered at Huyton as compared with that in Kempton Park. As in the other male internment camps, the women's internment experience was somewhat different. The organisation of day-to-day camp life was largely a matter for the internees themselves. There was an internee hierarchy made up of democratically elected house fathers, street fathers, and a camp father who together took necessary decisions, passed down instructions, and represented the internees with the British camp authorities. The camp father was a distinguished Austrian physicist, Professor Karl Weissenberg, previously from the University of Berlin, who in emigration had been working in Southampton University. Hollitscher's house father was another well-known figure from within the German-speaking immigration, the German trades unionist and social democrat Hans Gottfeucht. A feature of all the Second World War internment camps in Britain, to a greater or lesser extent, was the self-organisation of cultural, educational and intellectual life, and Huyton was no exception. Interned in Huyton, there were artists, academics, professional men of all kinds. It has been said that there were at least 22 university professors there, for example, leading to all manner of lectures, classes, musical events, and an art exhibition that Hollitscher describes in his diary. There was even, from early August 1940, an old Vienna cafe that served as an attractive social meeting place. Through this rich cultural mix, Hollitscher came into contact with men who, like Gottfeucht, were celebrated figures within different sections of the German refugee community. Another of these was the Austrian poet Fritz Gross, well known in certain refugee circles for the lending library that he ran from his basement flat in Bloomsbury. He charged 1 penny per week per book. Gross reportedly took part in a poetic evening, reading works created in the camp. While the majority of the camp population was Jewish, observant or non-observant, as indeed in the refugee population as a whole, there was also a minority of non-Jewish internees, for example, political refugees like the already mentioned Neymar Russell. Most of the internees were Germans or Austrians, but there were around 350 others who one way or another got caught up in the internment process, including Czechs and Poles, and others who, despite their British parentage, had been born in Germany, unluckily for them. There was even a group of elderly men who'd been born in Germany, but had lived in Britain for so long that they could no longer speak their native language. The despair that many of the internees felt at being cut off from their families, and at least initially being cut off from news of any kind, increased tension within the camp and even led to several cases of suicide. A further frustration for being deprived of news, probably a greater one, was the extreme slowness of the internee mail, caused by the fact that the letters both in and out of all the internment camps had to be centred in Liverpool by a staff insufficiently large for the task. Particularly at the beginning of alien internment, letters piled up in the sorting offices and could take weeks to arrive at their destination. Moreover, the delay did not merely lead to the lack of family news, though this could be upsetting enough. It also affected the internees' correspondence with legal representatives, for example, regarding the applications for release, or with the US and other embassies regarding vital visa appointments. Release was, of course, a major topic of conversation in Huyton as in the other internment camps, and rumours abounded. The public mood regarding the refugees and the need for internment for the sake of national security had softened over the summer. a change caused particularly by the sinking by the Germans of the Arendelle Star in July 1940. The Arendelle Star was a ship transporting German, Austrian, and Italian civilian internees, as well as prisoners of war, from Britain to internment in Canada. The great loss of life among those who were without doubt refugees from Nazi oppression was debated in some detail in both Houses of Parliament, which was another factor in the shift in the general British public perception. So finally, regulations concerning release from internment were published in 3 governmental white papers that created a procedure for release. Though I should say their implementation took some time, leading to great impatience in the refugee population. The first of these was published on the 31st of July 1940 and set out 18 different categories of refugee who were eligible for release. For example, the old, the young, the infirm, those engaged in work of national importance, or scientists, doctors, workers in industry or agriculture. The second white paper appeared a month later, at the end of August, and contained a 19th category, which stated that any person by his writing or speeches or political or official activities has consistently over a period of years taken a public and prominent part in opposition to the Nazi system and is actively friendly towards the Allied cause. And the third white paper of October 1940 included a further category of persons of eminent distinctions who have made outstanding contributions to art, science, learning, or letters. Wilhelm Hollidger previously made several attempts to obtain his release on the grounds of the heart complaint that troubled him throughout his internment, but he had not been successful. And in the end, it was not his state of health that brought about his release, but rather a ruling that reduced the upper age limit for internment from 70 to 65, clearing the way for the 67-year-old's release on the 1st of September 1940. But Hollidger was by no means alone in being medically unfit for internment, since Kempton contained an unusually high proportion of sick and elderly men. It was calculated that 40% of the camp population were over 50, and that 33% were suffering from serious complaints such as diabetes, heart trouble, blindness, and various mental afflictions. These, of course, were illnesses that would have indicated unfitness for internment in a better regulated system. As refugees from Nazi oppression, most of the genuine German and Austrian refugees were released from internment by mid-1941 or thereabouts. Many of those who'd been deported to Canada or Australia returned to Britain when shipping became available, though some chose to stay where they were and make new lives for themselves there. After the war, the vast majority of the Jewish refugees either opted to remain in Britain or to emigrate onwards to the USA or Palestine. There was little or nothing for them to return to Germany or Austria for. Some of the political refugees, however, decided to return home in order to play a part in post-war reconstruction, including political reconstruction. Kempton camp continued in existence as an alien internment camp until late 1941, despite having originally been designated a short-term transit camp, and it was next put to use as a prisoner of war camp, accommodating, among many others, Bert Trautmann of later football fame in Britain. The British policy of civilian internment continued on an increasingly small scale on the Isle of Man until September 1945, after the war, when the last of the internees, amounting to around 137 adults and accompanying children, were transferred to the mainland to the Cannons Park Aliens Reception Centre, from where they were either repatriated or released. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Brinson. As ever, compelling listening, and your scholarship is totally comprehensive, and you've added very much to this event. It gives me particular pleasure to introduce a great colleague of mine of over many years, Rachel Dixon. Rachel, a distinguished curator and previously head of our curatorial services, is currently Senior Research Manager at the recently established Benuri Research Unit for the study and recording of the Jewish and immigrant contribution to the British visual arts since 1900. Her research focuses on immigrant artists and immigrant artists and designers in Britain, particularly from the two principal waves of Jewish migration across the 19th and 20th century. She's a fellow committee member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies at London University, and she was contributing co-editor with her colleague and mine, Sarah McDougall, for the yearbook volume 19, The Applied Arts in British Exile from 1939. It is published by Brill and is a modest read of about 500 pages. It's difficult to hold it, but nonetheless exceptionally valuable in terms of adding real scholarship to the library of this period, and has contributed titled almost as impressive as its legacy in the visual arts, Benue Art Society and Music in Exile, 1931 to 1960, to the yearbook volume 22. She also curated an exhibition of the same title at the Royal College of Music some years ago. Recent conference papers have explored emigre art historians, J.P. Holden, Helen Rosenthal, and emigre artists Werner Jackson and Helga Michi. Recent publications include Mapping Finchley Strasse, Mittel Europe in Northwest London, co-authored with colleague Sarah McDougall, the director of Benue, in Arrival Cities, Migrating Artists, a New Metropolitan Topography in the 20th Century. And that's published by the University of Leuven in 2020. And Our Horizon in the Barbed Wire, Artistic Life in the British Internment Camps, in Insiders, Outsiders, Refugees from Nazi Europe and Their Contribution to British Visual Culture, which was published last year and is a book that must, like many, you must have in your library. So Rachel, it gives me always great pleasure to introduce you, and please talk about the art behind the wire.
Rachel, I think you're muted. Rachel? Oh. Are you struggling to unmute?
There we go. Sorry, you needed to let me unmute. You were in control. Anyway, thank you to the Wiener Holocaust Library for hosting. Thank you, David, for that very long introduction. I think it's nearly as long as my talk. Anyway, Toby is going to manage my slides for me. So perhaps, Toby, if you could move on to the first slide. And actually, just before I start, I've seen from the chat room that we have Miriam Murphy, who is Dachinger's daughter, with us this evening. And obviously that it lends a whole different flavor to the evening. So Miriam, we are really delighted that you're able to be here with us. And I'm sure you will add to the Q&A and the conversation at the end. Anyway, to return to Hollitscher's portrait, which I'm going to use to briefly discuss the relationship between interned artist and sitter and the importance of exiled artists, an issue which remains as relevant today as 80 years ago, evidenced by the creation of BURU, the Benuri Research Unit, to highlight the continuing Jewish and emigre contribution to British visual culture since 1900. We've heard from David and Innes how, in June 2016, Benuri was thrilled to acquire from auction this distinctive head and shoulders portrait of an unknown gentleman. Inscribed Dachinger, Heighton, and 40, we immediately recognized it as an internment portrait by Austrian emigre artist Hugo Dachinger. Dating from this difficult period in British wartime history, it was eagerly accessioned into Benuri's collection. Could I have the next slide, please? To join two later pen and ink drawings by Dachinger. On the left, Paul Hammond's drawing class from 1962, and on the right, Bell Street Market from 1977, each depicting different aspects of the artist's life in exile in London. The earlier work references Dachinger's close ties with fellow internees, many of whom stayed in contact after release, their shared experience providing a ready-made network of cultured German speakers, often living in close proximity to each other. The next slide, please. Many family archives in this new homeland retain address books full of émigré names, and you can see on the screen from Ernest Blensdorf's address book, many were grouped around Finchley Road or Finchley Strasse. You can see Hammond's entry top left, noted sculptor and pupil of Rodin. He was interned at Hutchinson on the Isle of Man, the so-called artist camp, given the number of high-profile artist internees, including the Dadaist Kurt Schwitters, who charged for his portraits, the expressionists Ludwig Meidner and Erich Kahn, Fred Ullman, and Ben-Hur's own first salaried curator, Fritz Solomonsky. Post-release, many attended Hammond's art classes, which he held with his wife Hilda in St. John's Wood. Hammond was also a founder of the Hampstead-based refugee organization, the Free German League of Culture. Alongside these works, the general details of Dachinger's biography was also known to us. Born in Gmunden in Austria, he studied advertising in Leipzig, patented a system of movable type in Germany, and returned to Austria to work for an international publisher. But following the Anschluss in 1938, as a Jew, his professional career was effectively over. Escaping to London in June, assisted by business contacts, he established Transposter Advertising. However, he suffered a second professional blow with the outbreak of war. As an enemy alien, he could no longer work in London. Nevertheless, he could at least channel his creativity as a fine artist freed from commercial constraints. As a direct result of Nazi persecution, several hundred modernist/Jewish/left-wing artists and designers took refuge here. Could I have the next slide, please? And it is through some of these figures, including Dachinger, and a number who featured in the Nazis' degenerate art exhibition of 1937, which you can see on the screen and the enormous queues outside, artists such as Ludwig Meidner, that Expressionism was introduced into Britain, albeit initially unsuccessfully. Next slide, please. Meidner, an Orthodox Jew, had his only exhibition in exile at Ben-Hur in 1949 with his wife Elsa, and he likened its success to a second-class funeral. Even artists such as Meidner, who had an established reputation in Germany, found it difficult to find a new audience and to secure patronage here, faced not only with the daily challenges of life in an unfamiliar country, with an unfamiliar language, but with the additional problem that, and I quote, "To the general public in Great Britain, modern German art is totally unknown." Next slide, please. And this was a quote from the critic and art historian Herbert Reed, writing in his introduction to the exhibition 20th Century German Art, which was held at the New Burlington Galleries in London in summer 1938 as a riposte to the Nazi degenerate art show. As far as the British public was concerned, many preferred their modern art to be French, without the darker mood, weighty introspection, and often gloomy palette of Expressionism. Could I have the next slide, please? As we've heard, Dachinger spent 5 months in Huyton and Hollitscher 10 weeks in crowded, unfinished houses intended for a single family, but each crammed with up to 17 internees. And you can see on the left the view of the housing estate and how the internees were literally separated from the wider public by strands of barbed wire and soldiers. And on the right, we have a page from Hollitscher's diary in which he sketches the floor plan of the house that he lived in. Other notable artists at Huyton included Samson Chames, Martin Bloch, Walter Nessler, Alfred Lomnitz, and Meidner. Hollitscher's diary provides a fascinating account of his internment from the 25th of June to the 31st of August, and it includes a description of the portrait sittings. And here's a description of his first meeting with Dachinger on the 16th of July. I quote from the diary. "In the Shipton Road, there lives a young painter, Dachinger, by name and appearance a pure Aryan type, who has painted the walls of his room, occupied by 5 people, with very good naked women." Both Hollitscher and Dachinger were among the circle of middle-class intellectuals, writers, and artists in Huyton whose collective presence contributed to the establishment of a range of cultural activities. And similar efforts evolved across all camps, including the so-called university at Hutchinson. Although Hollitscher was considerably older than Dachinger, a warm friendship developed, which continued post-internment, with Hollitscher making efforts through the Blitz to visit Dachinger's exhibitions in London, in venues such as Internee Jack Bilbo's Modern Art Gallery, and witnessing Dachinger's marriage on the 24th of April, 1943, all recorded in his diary. Next slide, please. Dachinger made many portraits in camp, from empathetic, instantly recognizable likenesses, such as the portrait on the left, to more modernist, semi-abstract interpretations with the graphic qualities of a poster, such as this collaboration with Fritz Rosen on the right. Rosen also wanted to draw Hollitscher. The image on the right celebrates internee Kurt Jus, founder of the German ballet Jus and the Jus Leader School of Dance. With its surreal, mismatched eyes, splashes of brilliant colour, and paint layered over collaged sheets of the Manchester Guardian, as curator Jessica Feather has suggested, internment gave the artists, quote, a degree of freedom to practice what had been banned in Germany. Dachinger also produced landscapes, the aforementioned nudes, including those enlivening the camp's very own Café Vienna, posters, and next slide, please. Complex multi-figured genre scenes depicting daily life in camp, such as potato peelers on the left, and more brooding campscapes on the right, in a somber palette where the composition is often divided by the ever-present linear motifs of perimeter fence, barbed wire, and watchtowers. Beyond a basic desire to accurately represent camp topography, daily privations, petty humiliations, and the sheer boredom of internment, Dachinger also hinted at more complex psychological issues faced by the internees, wrestling with loss of identity, detained by the very country in which they had sought refuge. Some had already been in German concentration camps and were haunted by their memories. Many were also uneasy at their ambiguous status, wondering whether, in the event of invasion, they would be handed over to the Germans from whom they had already fled. Have the next slide, please. In Dachinger's view of the camp, overlain with a single surreal head and entitled A Mad, Mad World, he succinctly sums up the whole wretched and destabilizing experience of internment. Although some artists were too depressed to work, others responded enthusiastically, professional and amateur alike. As traditional materials were in short supply, artists became increasingly resourceful. Newspapers repurposed as painting surfaces were primed with gelatin from boiled down bones mixed with flour, often leaving stories of war tantalizingly visible. Twigs were burnt to create charcoal, and paint was made from brick dust, toothpaste, or vegetable juice ground with linseed oil or olive oil from sardine cans. I have the next slide, please. A photographic anthology in Picture Post, the news magazine known for its pioneering photojournalism and an impeccable emigre pedigree, profiled Dachinger in September 1949, and you can see the Ben-Uri portrait of Hollitscher in the center on the right, but he is anonymous. It's portrait of anonymous internee. Next slide, please. And here you can see the double page spread with Dachinger's images grouped around the central spine of the double page. The caption described Dachinger's methods, and I quote, using a brush made from his own hair and newspaper for canvas. Says he gets his best results on the front page of the Times, but if hard put to it, could muddle through with the Daily Telegraph or Manchester Guardian. Big headline papers, e.g. Daily Express, unsuitable. Large lettering shouts through paint. Nevertheless, individual words or phrases were often incorporated to striking effect, no doubt facilitated by Dachinger's designer's eye. Next slide, please. This heightened portrait is made all the more dramatic and poignant by the focus on the single word, bottom right, search. Next slide, please. As we've heard, over a fortnight in August 1940, Hollitscher recorded the sittings for 4 portraits with Dachinger, the first on the 5th of August, and I quote from the diary. Dachinger is making a pastel picture of me. This afternoon was my first sitting. He says that I don't laugh and he finds my head interesting. On completion on the 8th of August, Hollitscher described it as, quote, colourful, quite modern style, interesting for me. He sees me such as I am. I look like a Prussian general. Strange resemblance to a photo that Hansel took of me after my first operation. More severe, more sombre, more suffering. My look, sharp, features with high cheekbones. Dachinger wants to make a second sketch, and his friend likewise. The newspaper in the Benary portrait is dated 6th of August, so perhaps it is the second portrait. It has a military feel, unconsciously reinforced by the visible headline, Air Fights in Many Spheres, top right, while Dachinger's blue and yellow palette appears in other heightened portraits. The photo on the right is one of the other 3 portraits, details and whereabouts unknown. Dachinger's empathetic treatment of his fellow internees contrasts with the sharply satirical and sometimes cartoonish works he made featuring the British camp officers. On the 14th of August, Hollitscher described Dachinger's third portrait, and I quote, I think the best yet. He says he is beginning to know me. Now he has discovered my intellectual head, and I, simple fool, have discovered it too. He notes Dachinger's final version on the 21st of August, depicting the, quote, whole figure. The head, in my opinion, is the most successful. He gave me a sample of a beautifully created invitation by him and Rosen to the art exhibition and invited me to a sausage feast. Hollitscher then notes Dachinger's gift of a portrait sketch on the 26th of August, just prior to his release, which, quote, is generally approved of as good, a nice memento. And it's worth noting that portraits taken from internment often serve as important documents of captivity, providing vital clues to the identity of both artist and sitter, particularly for the Manx men's camps, where records are surprisingly patchy. Next slide, please. On the 30th of August, just prior to his release, Hollitscher visited the camp exhibition, Art Behind Wire, advertised with Dachinger's own poster. Hollitscher described it thus, quote, in a new corrugated iron shed. The presentation was excellent, with paper screens, sections. Obviously in camp, these were primitive measures. Dachinger has his own small room, my picture and Kramer's, everything on newspaper, much in pencil, charcoal, pastels and watercolor. Some very good portraits, very witty caricatures. A lot of people say that Dachinger is the best and most talented. End quote. Hollitscher was then released. Next slide, please. And Dachinger transferred to the Isle of Man, from where he was finally released in January 1941. And Dachinger promptly held his first exhibition in a real London gallery in April 1941 at the Red Fern in Cork Street, where it is still located today, accompanied by the now familiar Art Behind Wire poster. This exhibition, along with others, facilitated by émigré gallerists, helped exiled artists to bring new art to Britain, whether unfashionable expressionism or hard-edged Bauhaus modernism. And along with new art, these exiles brought new directions in photography, design and photojournalism, art teaching, architecture, art publishing, the new academic discipline of art history, and an entire cohort of art dealers, gallerists and restorers. The list of the contributions of the so-called Hitler émigrés to British visual culture is vast, and this provides an appropriate moment for me to stop. If we could have just the very last slide. As we launch a book celebrating a friendship born out of art in internment 80 years ago at an event hosted by institutions which continue to preserve and promote the extraordinary creative legacy of exile. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As always, wonderful to listen to, and the knowledge is tremendous. I think it's time that we ask Ines to bring us back to Wilhelm, to her grandfather, and to perhaps read us some extracts from his diary. Would you do that for us?
You'll need to unmute again, Ines.
As you can see, everybody, we're not good at unmuting.
There we are.
Okay.
Okay. So I hope I don't take too long on this. It's about just over 10 minutes. So I thought I'd read some varied extracts to give you an impression, really, of his style and both the grim and the more joyful side of it. So the first extract is the 27th of June, the day he was arrested. Sensation. Since yesterday morning, I have been interned. At 8:30, I was in the bath, and a detective appeared, giving me an hour. At Kempton Park, a racecourse, great confusion. About 1,800 people. I am group number 28/2, number 1428. So I have finally, at the age of 67, become a mere number. All valuables, documents and knives were taken off us. Books and writing materials, after inspection by an officer, were returned, thank goodness. This is only a transit camp. We are to move on in about 2 days' time. Given a mattress and 2 blankets, we slept close to one another on the ground. Morning ablutions were quite difficult. A crush. Not much fun. Could be worse. 3 days later, on the 30th of June. Yesterday morning at 10:30, 645 of us were transported by a special train from Kempton to here, an alien internment camp in Liverpool. The last noteworthy happenings in Kempton. The day before yesterday, newcomers arrived all day. On Friday evening and Saturday morning, there were services in a specially designated hall. I became aware, as I was having my evening tea in the open air, of the Leica Dodi being sung. The Leica Dodi is a prayer that Jews sing on Friday nights to welcome in the Sabbath. They are, for the most part, Eastern Jews, but also many Germans. I did not participate, but observed them from outside. Fanatic faith, grim determination, not to be eradicated by 100 Hitlers. The journey here arrived at 5 p.m. this afternoon in a first-class carriage. No water. At departure and arrival, the older people were separated and transported by car to the camp, which was half an hour on foot from the station. But I, who was one of the oldest, was not taken by car. Apparently, I looked too young. Same fate in the camp here. Different atmosphere here. Warmer, more peaceful. Reception. Only the top brass are militaristic. Most of the rest are interned Jews. Very friendly, but it's a lousy setup. My group is in a large tent, about 25 by 10 meters. We are handed one rubber sheet for the floor, straw and straw sacks, a pillowcase, and 4 woolen covers. We had to fill the pillows and sacks ourselves. Distribution lasted until 11 at night, a bit too much for me. I had heart palpitations, lay down for half an hour. 2nd of July 1940. The commanding officers have made their lives easy. They leave it to the prisoners to sort out things to their satisfaction. Self-government. It works quite well, except for people who go off and do their own thing. Everything summons up Jewish enterprise and a lot of noisy chatter. They are funny, my Jews. Without some business, they can't stand it. Everywhere there are beginnings of business ventures, mostly medical stations, a hospital, post office, a camp bank, and a lot of good, healthy humour. Caricaturist Harold Lester, a cartoonist of the Enemy's newspaper, has a weather idea, which has been published by the Advertising Bureau. In the main street, Parbrook Road, on every corner, there is a polisher. The best one is the Internees, who attracts clients with his good jokes. 1 shoe, a halfpenny, a pair, a penny. There are several hairdressers. The sign for the laundry, called Star View, is a starry sky with a comet tail, text reading, "It is already night, but Star View is still washing." The canteen is always crowded, and so you're pleased to get something. There is an exchange, opt-ball rates, where you can advertise new razor blade sort in exchange for 5 cigarettes, a pair of socks for 2 ties, 10 words for 1 penny. There is Camp Porridge University, a gym, keep fit program by practical training, a tailor, a shoemaker, and particularly popular is Chance, who offer to do the washing up, do your clothes or carry water. The hotel is in one of the workers' houses and offers gourmet food, alcoholic beer, schnapps and wine. It is, of course, all a joke. And there is a billing of a show, The Virgin Girls. Turnover, with the exception of the restaurant, is in pennies. We still cannot write letters. This will last a few days more. We will be allowed 28 lines. Now, the next section is quite a grim one, written just over a week later. 10th of July. The camp yesterday was like a swarm of bees before their flight. The list of those 1,200 prisoners designated to travel overseas had to be completed, and as there were not enough volunteers, the missing numbers were selected ex officio. Among them were 55-year-old married people who'd lived here for years and built up a life for themselves. In the faces of the departing travellers, one could read all human emotions. Among the young, mostly, there was thoughtless unconcern. Among the older ones, resignation and despair. In addition, it was raining. Leave-taking from Maya and Dr. Philippe was hard. To see the big man crying, I must keep smiling. Another grim one the following day. Yesterday, I forgot to mention that an older man in one of the barracks attempted suicide through poisoning. Saw him being taken out unconscious. Cold, rainy weather, you sink in the mud. The worst scandal is there is no WC paper. The feeling that I am running about so dirty and filthy is not pleasant. Hope I don't become ill. This morning I remained lying down and had unpleasant heart palpitations and breathing difficulties. Keep smiling. On the 15th of June, they had a new commandant in the camp, and the entries then get a lot more cheerful and the suicides actually stop. 22nd of July, 1940. Yesterday evening, there was a football match played near the barracks. Almost all the players were Viennese. Among the spectators were English officers and soldiers who had access to the camp or were part of a team, joyous. An English sentry with a gun, who was standing guard at the barracks behind the pitch, twice kicked the ball, which had landed behind the goalpost, to the goalie. Only in England could this happen. 23rd of July. Yesterday evening there was a concert in Hut 1. Two brothers, one a pianist and the other a violinist. They played Bach, Beethoven's Spring Sonata, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. Good. Carl did some washing. My pyjamas too. I had not thought how he does the washing. He does it by swishing his underpants through the cold water, then he holds them up against the light. If they're transparent, he's highly satisfied, chuckles happily and hangs them up without ringing. 1st of August. There was a march to the parade ground for exercise under heavy military guard. Only 300 were admitted and about 500 had to stay behind. I no longer take part, not necessary. The feeling of being a prisoner must be concealed. During the last week, a certain R posted a letter openly into a public post box and was locked up for 8 days. He had wanted, by doing this, to demonstrate against the oppressive postal conditions. This is one of the greatest scandals. Daily, a maximum of 200 letters get distributed, whereas 6,000 letters are posted weekly, which are surely answered. 4th of August. Today, the opening of a cafe, Old Vienna, in Camp 3. I went to have a look. It's a charming room with colourful frescoes, pictures of this year's wine, and a Danube steamer boat humorously painted. In the street, there are about 20 tables with chairs. I imagine these will very soon be knit. It's hard to see where the people have got them from. Weather continues beautiful. 2 air raids at night. At the first one, I got up. I was not yet asleep in order to see something, but thank God, There was only a clear, star-studded sky. At the second, I hardly woke. These air raids continued, and a bomb fell very close to the camp. It was fairly near to the Liverpool docks. 7th of August. I received from Gottfried and Mittler the programme of all the lectures and courses running in the camp. It provides an interesting as well as a spiritually uplifting example of irrepressible Jewish intellectual force and energy, although a few Aryans can also be included. This enjoyment, spending the whole day and deep into the night, going from one lecture to the next, with an absolute sincere, enthusiastic search for knowledge, unconditionally leads me to wish for an interesting conversation with Professor Liebert, an exchange of views about the New World Order, society after the war, involving philosophers in the whole world, 48 universities. Liebert was a Kantian philosopher, and in 1942 he was involved in setting up or running a German cultural facility in London. I have rejected such a proposal, being fully convinced about the purposelessness of philosophy. Although Gottfried tells me that Plato said centuries ago that a proper world order can only be brought about by philosophy, everyone forgets that the great mysticism in every person, the heart and the brain, and all that is connected to them. If people would keep to the godly ethics of religion and live according to them, we would not need all the speculations of philosophers. And finally, this is from the epilogue. He starts by talking about why internment took place and speculating that it had something to do with fascists at very senior levels of the government. And then he concludes by saying, anyway, I have benefited from these last few months, which for me have been a valuable lesson in goodness and decency, as well as a stimulating adventure, which I consider an enrichment of my twilight years. Apart from satisfying my sense of adventure, which at my age is something, I've got to know some fantastic people. Thanks to my innate positive attitude, I was able to give encouragement to those who are feeling depressed. But what will remain with me for the rest of my life is the knowledge of friendship and love and attachment and warmth of all the Petswoodians. The Petswoodians was where he's returned to, his home in South London. So it is in life. It is only when one falls into distress and needs help that real friendship reveals itself. They were all touchingly kind to me. So I came back with the feeling that I was back home again. I'm among good, empathetic friends to whom, as long as I live, I shall continue to be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really remarkable to know that under this sort of condition, these sorts of words, this innate optimism, charm and warmth comes through. Wonderful. May I ask Toby, before we have questions and answers, I wonder whether Miriam Murphy, Dachinger's daughter, would be kind enough to say hello, and if she felt able to do so. I believe she's with us.
If you would like to unmute, I'll see if it asks me or whether it lets you. I'm not quite sure what the settings allow here, but give it a try. Give unmuting a try if you'd like to say something. I'm slightly worried that the setting we've chosen won't allow this, David. I'm sorry. If there was anything I could do, I would.
Okay, well, Miriam, know that you are most welcome, and it's really exciting for you to be here. And I hope that afterwards we can all get together on Zoom, and then one day actually get together physically over a cup of coffee or a sandwich.
My colleague tells me she is actually unmuted now, so I don't know if you'd like to speak now. Give it a go. No, it looks like we're being thwarted on this one, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
Okay. Question and answer time, please.
Okay, great. So we've had lots and lots of comments and only a couple of specific questions. So if people have been keeping them to themselves until now, please do post. So I have a question from Dr. Susan Cohen, and she's asked how common was the surname Hollitscher, and she asks specifically because the Refugee Committee of the British Federation of University Women appointed Erna Hollitscher, a Jewish refugee from Austria, as their secretary in 1939. Is it possible that she might have had relatives in the UK, is the first question. And then there's the second part of Susan's question, which is, did Wilhelm mention at all Eleanor Rathbone's visit in July 1940? So I wonder if Ines or perhaps Charmian might want to say. Ines?
Well, I can briefly say on the Hollitscher, I think it was quite a common name because his sister, Ida Hollitscher, married someone called Gustav Hollitscher, so ended up with the same surname, who wasn't related to her at all. So it's not as common as the Oppenheimer, which was my other half of my family, but I think it was fairly common. And yes, he does mention Eleanor Rathbone. I don't know whether Charmian would like to say anything more about Eleanor. She came to the camp and was obviously very important in campaigning to end internment.
Charmian, you'll need to unmute. Sorry, we're having a bit of a relay race of unmuting. Well done. You've managed it.
I mastered it. Well, Eleanor Rathbone, actually, Susan Cohen knows more about Eleanor Rathbone than anybody, having written her biography and so on. But she was a member of Parliament and very active on behalf of the refugees. She, of course, came to a number of the camps to visit them, as did the famous George Bell, Bishop George Bell, who spent a lot of his time going from camp to camp. George Bell also visited British fascists, 18B fascists, who were imprisoned, interned, because they came from his diocese. That's where they came from, his diocese. So he had a broad spectrum of the idea of what he should do to people who are imprisoned.
Thank you, Charmian.
I'll ask Susan herself to say something about that.
I would, again, but I think that there's this issue of muting. So I might move on to the next question if that's all right. So just a question from James Bauer. This might be one for Rachel, perhaps. James notices that several of the paintings have an affinity to the work of Otto Dix. Sorry, Rachel, you're not able to speak?
Right, thank you. Sorry, Toby, you were controlling the mute, so I couldn't unmute.
Okay.
Okay, so now I'm unmuted.
Great.
Well, I think so. I think this is the feel that one gets when one's looking at expressionist art. So there is a sense, in Dix's works, the power, the criticism of regime, and this is what comes through very clearly in Dachinger's works. I mean, Dachinger worked across a complete range of styles, and as you look through the monograph that is published by Gallery Supan in Vienna, you'll see this range, but this strong expressionist feel, I think this was the thing that underpinned a lot of his work, and this was the kind of mood that the British public didn't respond to, this heaviness, this kind of direct criticism, this deep satire, and a deep kind of psychological vein within the work. So as we were saying before, Dachinger was an expressionist. Otto Dix, of course, a lot of what he was expressing was after the First World War. So it's a slightly different time frame. This is in Weimar, Germany. But again, at the root, this is human expression, human experience, human condition of really terrible, evil events.
So I'm getting a few questions that are asking more broadly about internment and its legacy. So I'm going to maybe ask panelists to reflect on that at the end. But before coming to that sort of broader question, I have a couple more specific ones. So Monica Bohm-Dutchen asks, Rachel, do you know much about how the exhibition at the Redfern Gallery came about?
No, but I do know that the Redfern has some archive material, so it is possible to explore further. But as you'll see in the book, the third party that's involved in the whole publicity around Hollitscher's diaries, which Ines touched upon, about this desire to make the diaries publicly available with illustrations, is through a Hungarian gentleman called Charles Rosner, who was a bit of a impresario and had fingers in many pies and was a great facilitator. And he may have been involved, and that's an area that needs more exploration. But as I say, also Redfam do have good archives.
Thank you. I had another sort of more specific question, which was about the children of the internees, and wondering about whether this distinction was made according to where they were born in terms of how they were treated, and particularly what would have happened to them if they only had one parent, a father especially, because there was, you know, a bit of a conversation about mothers and young children being settled elsewhere. So I don't know whether that might be one for you, Charmian.
Yes, I'll have a go at this. As you say, the children up to the age of 16 were able to go with their mothers to Russian camp or to St. Mary. Well, Russian camp was formed of Port St. Mary and Port Erin. And they had a school there and activities for the children. It wasn't a terribly happy place for them, obviously, but they were with their mothers. Now, the children of fathers, there was no equivalent arrangement for them. They didn't ever go with their fathers to internment camps. And the few cases I've read of, they were either left with relations behind in London, say, or some accommodation has to be made for them. So was that the whole question? I can't remember.
So, yes. Fascinating answer as well. Thank you. And then we have another question from James asking about whether the camp at Hoyton still exists and whether there are markers to what transpired.
I have been there once. We were in Liverpool and we thought we'll go and visit the camp. And we had a taxi driver who hadn't a clue where the camp was or what it was. When we got there, there was just basically a field with one or two houses on it. And there was no marker there when we were there. It was quite difficult for us to find it, in fact. Well, that was about 10 years ago, so possibly things have changed since.
How fascinating. Well, we're getting lots of great comments to the chat, and in fact, the chat itself contains lots of interesting information, and that is something that we will be retaining. And so if there anyone wanted to sort of request particular information that they've spotted in the chat and they're not able to capture it now, please do get in touch with the library. And also, I should say there was a question about this presentation coming on to YouTube, and it will be both on Ben Uri's and the Wien Holocaust Library's YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit it or send the link to others, please do. But as a final question, there were some more general questions around the legacy of internment, what sort of thoughts it might provoke for us today, as you know, in light of the way that refugees are treated today. And so I thought I'd just ask everyone who's spoken to just offer either any reflections on what they've heard this evening or any thoughts on the legacy of internment. So I don't know whether maybe we should start perhaps with Anthony. Absolutely right to unmute first, Anthony.
I've learned something. No, as I said, most of what I know about internment, I learned from my father, who was very knowledgeable. And as I saw on one of the chat lines that came up about an hour ago, reference was made to David Baddiel's book, in which he described his grandfather's, well, it was based on his grandfather's experience in the Isle of Man. In fact, my father participated in that program and was interviewed by David Baddiel. But I think not so much about what we can learn today. I think the internment camps were a great opportunity for the German and Austrian Jews, who they formed relationships and unions and friendships there that extended throughout their lifetime. And although it wasn't an enjoyable experience, it was certainly something that, having gone through it, they look back upon it, I believe, as an important stepping stone in their life to become completely integrated British citizens.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm tempted to give Ines the last word, if others don't mind. So I might go over to Charmian next.
Well, I don't think we've learned a great deal, that's all I can say. I think in some ways, although it sounds odd to say this, that the refugees of the 1930s and 40s on the whole received a rather better deal than today's refugees.
Thank you, Charmian. And Rachel?
Yes, no, I would agree with Char, and there were certainly many positive experiences from internment. I mean, Ludwig Meidner petitioned to stay on, which seems extraordinary, but he was an Orthodox Jew, and he cultivated a sort of cultured environment, and he lived in real sort of abject poverty in London without any recognition, whilst in internment he had a cultured cohort to spend time with. He got kosher food, he was given art materials, and he could produce work. So for him, it was clearly a very, very positive experience. And I somehow can't see that being the case with today's refugees. Seems a very different state of affairs.
Thank you, Rachel. And then over to you, Ines. Oh, and one last unmute. Oh, no, almost. There we go.
Sorry. Yeah, I agree with Shah that we really should be learning a lot more from it. I mean, one of the things that worried me about the internment in Haydn was how little the guards really understood where these people had come from. They thought they were just Nazis, as she said, and they were really surprised that they were Jews who were against Hitler. And I think there's a lot of lack of understanding in today in the way that refugees are treated, in not understanding why they come to this country. You know, people say, oh, these illegal immigrants. I think one could learn a lot from studying the internment policy about how we should be thinking about people who give up their lives and come over here. And then there should be, you know, there's still, in each war, we do it again, or in each, both the Irish and I think Charmin says in the Iraq war, there were people still locked up then, which I hadn't been aware of. So reflecting on it, I think it remains an extremely important thing, and hopefully we will learn lessons. I don't hope there's never another war, but if we do, I hope we don't lock up people again who are.
Thank you, Ines. And I'll now hand over to David for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Toby. I think everybody will agree with me that it's really been a fascinating evening to hear the stories of this time, the stories of internment through the writings of an internee and through the investigative powers of his granddaughter and his grandchildren has enlightened us considerably. I would like to just make 2 points, if I may, about the 2 institutions that are hosting this evening. We both are actively involved in scholarship, in research, and in disseminating that knowledge to the largest amount of people around us. And that doesn't need to be either in Russell Square or St. John's Wood. Tonight is a perfect example of the power of the internet. We have, I see and know people from America, Belgium, France, Ireland. I'm pretty sure even from my beloved homeland, Scotland. And that is the power and the opportunity that is now in front of us. We are the producers of content, but the other side of that, we're the manufacturers of the product, or at least the revealers of the product. But the other side of that, which we have to become more and more and more expert in, is the dissemination of the project, of the content. And the internet allows us that opportunity to spread this knowledge and inspire people to then spread it further in a way that pre-internet couldn't possibly achieve. And that's very much I know the philosophy of the Wiener Library, the Wiener Holocaust Library, whose research is unparalleled. And it certainly is research in Ben Uri, because 2 years ago, we decided that for our institution as a small gallery museum who has delusions of grandeur in terms of our ambitions and our purpose compared to our scale, we decided that actually it was just simply unsustainable to produce what we wanted to produce from 1,500 square feet in the back end of St. John's Wood. And that was the inspiration, the logic, the rationale for completely transforming from being the normal museum, which is a physical building, a physical presence with a digital element, to being a digital institution with a physical presence. And it's transformed our engagements. You know, over 80% of British museums are considered small and medium. We believe that over 50% of museums in this country attract less than 100 people a week. That's 15 people a day. We are now engaging 25,000 people a month. I'm not talking about impressions and brand awareness, I'm talking about practical engagements of people clicking onto different pages on benuri.org. There's a film on the website. That is our future. And the reason why is because we have two products that can be best disseminated digitally. We have the Arts and Health Institute, and we have the Research Institute, the research unit looking and recording the Jewish and the immigrant contribution to British art since 1900. It is our ability to communicate the information, but it is your responsibility to disseminate it further. History is only alive through storytelling. And it is through exercises like this where 300, 400 people are engaged and listening and picking something up new. If we can inspire you just enough to tell somebody else, then the history, the lessons of the past can and will influence, please God, our future. So I say to you, buy the book, and Black Friday deals, even through the Wiener Institute, the Vienna Library and the Benuri Gallery, even we do Black Friday deals, 20% off, can't ask for more than that. Buy the book, read it, but more importantly, not just support the Wiener Holocaust Library in Benuri and get involved, but tell the stories to your friends, your family, your children, and then there is a hope, not only that they will remember these experiences, but maybe society will become kinder. Thank you so much indeed. Stay safe. God bless you all.
Thank you.